Our next speaker will be Kimberly Goyette.
Okay. Thank you all for having me. Let me get this slide show. And we'll start from the current slide. Okay.
Move the mic in.
Oh, yeah, of course. I'm the sociologist curmudgeon. I always am. I want to talk a little bit about, I know that the focus of today's talk is really about how residential segregation affects school segregation, but I want to add a little bit to that and talk about how school segregation affects residential segregation. We know that there's a link between residential segregation and school segregation. Where you live determines largely where you go to school. Not perfectly. We know that schools are more segregated than residences, generally, than neighborhoods. And largely that's because of the way neighborhoods integrate. They integrate most quickly among young families and less quickly among older people. So schools tend to be more segregated than the neighborhoods from which the children are drawn. We also know that the connection between residence and school segregation is looser thanks to a lot of choice programs. But my most recent data from the National Center of Education Statistics from 2007 shows that about 73% of students attend their public assigned schools, those neighborhood schools. Now that's from 2007. Much has changed since then, but I think it's fair to say that probably a majority, maybe not a large majority, but a majority of children attend their assigned neighborhood schools. So my concern then is not between residential segregation and school segregation, but more about how this school segregation affects where people live. So it's kind of flipping this around a little bit. And I have a couple of research projects that I think are linked in that they share this concern. So the first research project that I was looking at on this topic was actually how people perceive segregated schools, or rather how people perceive schools that are just beginning to integrate. The idea is that if people perceive that there are schools with low quality, they're less likely to move to those neighborhoods where those schools of low quality are, or where they perceive that there's low quality. So I was interested in people's perceptions of how school quality changes as schools integrate. This research was done in the Philadelphia area. It was done in the 9 counties surrounding Philadelphia. And it was done in 2003, a long time ago now. But I'm sorry, not 2003, 2008. I've got to put the 5 years on there. So what I looked at is how people in a neighborhood perceived the quality of their school over the last 5 years against how that school, that neighborhood school, so the school that was closest to their houses, changed in terms of the racial composition. I looked at the percentage change in the black students and the percentage change in other minority students. And what this graph is showing you is how likely people were to say that school quality had declined. And these are neighborhood residents that are closest to this school. If you look, it's hard to see, I'm sorry, there's a 0, and that's where that little dip is at the bottom. That's for 0% change in either black or percentage change in other minority. You can see that as schools just begin to integrate, so as the percentage black and the percentage minority increase just a little bit, so there's a change, and this is over the past 5 years, from about 0 to about 7 percentage points, either in percent black or about 10 percentage points in percent other minority. You see that people are more likely to perceive the school quality had declined. This is even when I control for other characteristics that might indicate school quality decline, such as changing percentage, changing test scores, changing percentage of violent incidents reports, and changing percent poverty. So even above and beyond all of those other indicators that people might use to judge school quality, people are, according to, at least in the 9-county area around Philadelphia, people are using racial change as an indicator of declining school quality. So given that, people may be choosing houses differently. And they may choose houses based on the quality of their homes. So in a related project, also in 2008, and a survey of the 9 counties around Philadelphia, I asked people specifically on the survey who chose their houses primarily for their school district, primarily to go to that district. And I can show you some demographic differences between people who said that they chose their house primarily for the school and people who didn't. You can see that that white people are more likely to have said that they chose the school district, their home specifically for that school district, than are non-white people. People who are in the middle income range, so between $40,000 and $80,000, were more likely to have chosen their home for the school, according to their reports. And they were much more likely than people under $40,000, as you might guess, that people who had less than $40,000 had less choice. People who had more than $80,000 were slightly less likely than that middle income group, probably because they also had access to private schooling. Those who had bachelor's degrees or higher were more likely to say they chose their school through their home compared to those who didn't. And those who were in the suburbs were more likely to say that they chose their school through choosing their home, through buying a home. So the next piece that I wanted to bring to this discussion has to do with what this means for segregation. What do we know about segregation? What we know about segregation, again, it's hard to see, but it is in your packet, so hopefully that'll be a little bit clear, is that households with children are the most segregated household types. They're more segregated than married couple-only households, and they're more segregated than than all households with all sorts of arrangements. But households with children are the most segregated. Typically, anything above, these I'm showing in this particular table, these are dissimilarity indices that show what percentage of households in a census tract, in this case, would have to move in order to achieve the racial balance of the metropolitan district. Anything above 0.6 is considered pretty high. You can see that for all comparisons, those households with children are among the highest, particularly for dissimilarity indices between blacks and whites. That it's true for both the poor and the non-poor, so households that are classified as poverty level or below, and those who are above the poverty level. It is true. In fact, it is even a little more distinct for blacks and whites for those who are in poverty. So it's not a matter of resources. So another question I asked in a different research project, this one at the national level, had to do with how people make choices about moving out of neighborhoods, whether the racial composition of a neighborhood mattered in moving out of neighborhoods. And we know it does, but it turns out that it matters differently if you have children, and particularly if you have young children. So whites with young children are much more likely than any other group, whites with children under the age of 6, so people who may be making decisions about schools, are much more likely to move out of their neighborhoods if their neighborhoods are at or above the median percentage black, than are those without kids and then are those with older kids. So people with young children are the most likely to react to neighborhood racial composition when moving out of neighborhoods. That's when neighborhood racial composition, these are whites, that's when neighborhood racial composition is measured as percentage black, or as something called entropy, which is simply the racial mix of a neighborhood. So not simply percentage black, but percentage of all racial groups. So that's sort of entropy is sort of a measure of racial diversity. And it's also true for racial diversity, although the pattern is much stronger when we look at percentage blacks. This pattern does not occur among non-whites. Non-whites are not more likely to move out of neighborhoods, particularly those with young children, based on percentage black or entropy of the neighborhood or diversity of the neighborhood. So I'm interested in this process of how neighborhood segregation, how school segregation influences neighborhood segregation in an attempt to show how pernicious this cycle is, that really we have to look at it from both aspects. It's not just residential segregation influencing school segregation, but also school segregation influencing residential segregation. And I put up this book because there's a lot of work that I and Annette LaRoe have done. We put together an edited volume with great authors who talk about a lot of these issues, about choosing homes, choosing schools, and how that might affect residential segregation. So if you're interested in this, I urge you to take a look at it.
Great, great. Again, the hashtag for this meeting is @segregatedschools, @segregatedschools. And again, in your packets are the cards, and if you have any questions, please make sure you write your question on there so that we can begin to engage that.